So today we are wrapping up our four-part sermon series, the Overboard Love of God, as we look at the rest or the final chapter of the book of Jonah. It's been kind of nice for a 4-week sermon series. There are 4 chapters to the book of Jonah, so we've been looking at a chapter every week that we've been covering this. And we do apologize for the part 3 of this that we had at the park. We did record it. We're working to get that up to our website. So if you missed any of the parts of that, you'll be able to see that, and also to pick up on this one as well. But to explore the overboard love of God in this 4-part study of this book of Jonah. It's a crazy thing to think about, this God whose love just is overboard and over the top in so many ways. And where we left off in our story, if you haven't joined us as part of this series or you missed a part or two, we are in the part of the story that the work where Jonah was given this message from God to go speak to the Ninevites, which is part of the Assyrian Empire, evil people as they were, and Jonah was called, and he didn't want to go, and of course then God provides this great storm, and then he causes Jonah to fall off a boat where he was trying to go in the opposite direction of Nineveh, and he got swallowed up by a great fish. So many people know that part of the story, and it's there. He is in there for 3 days, says a prayer to the Lord, and he spit back out, and he goes to Nineveh. Where we looked at last week, and very appropriate for being Labor Day weekend, was the work that Jonah had to do, was to proclaim that basically salvation comes from the Lord to the Ninevites. And what happened? We kind of looked at this last week, that the people responded how? By hearing the message that Jonah was preaching, and they repented of their sin. And I finished off last week with reading the first verse of chapter 4 to kind of get a sense of where this thing's going to take us. Because here's the response of Jonah, chapter 4, verse 1. But to Jonah, after all these people, over 100,000 people, come to the Lord, surrender their hearts. But Jonah, seemed very wrong? Interesting. And he became angry. What a response. I find that hard to believe almost. You know, as a pastor who's preached for many years, I love it when just one person comes to the saving knowledge of Jesus. I get so excited about that. That can keep me charged during low points in my ministry for months if I hear one person surrendering their life to Jesus. And here we have, Jonah going to preach that salvation comes from the Lord alone. Over 120,000 people come to the Lord. And Jonah thinks that's very wrong. He becomes angry. What's up with that? Something's not right on this, right? I mean, does anyone else feel that maybe Jonah just doesn't have this quite figured out yet? Because something seems to be missing, and it's worth pondering for all of us. Why was Jonah not full of joy for the salvation of many people? And it's something for us to consider when we think about this story. Because even prophets chosen by God, he has a book of the Bible named after him. There's 66, he's got a book named after him as a prophet of God in the Bible, yet we see him wrestling, which we see a sin that seems to be within, that all these people come to a saving knowledge of the Lord. What's up with that? But it makes me feel kind of good, right? Because he has this guy that says he's struggled with this. So maybe a message for us contained within, with maybe the sin that we keep deep within. Which leads me to the title of this last part of this 4-part series, A Love of the Enemy, look at this, within. Because I think we get to the heart of what's going on in Jonah in this story today. Which, by the way, on the first week of this sermon series, if you were here, I told a story about Pastor Cho, and it was a great story, actually, that tied in very nicely with the story of Jonah. Does anyone remember who was here and was present for that story? Pastor Cho was the pastor at the largest church in the world in Korea. And he was one of these people that when he came to the Lord and said, Lord, I will do whatever you want me to do, but he did have a problem. He did say, but do not send me to, remember the country? You got it because the flag's up there, right? Don't send me to Japan. I don't like those people. Why didn't he like those people? Because it was the Japanese that during World War II had been in Korea and created a great deal of punishment and ill will toward the Korean people. That was Pastor Cho's people. So he wanted nothing to do with the Japanese. He said, Lord, I'll do whatever you want, just don't send me there. And with our story of Jonah, he didn't want to go to Nineveh because of all his enemies were the Ninevites that were there. But Pastor Cho went, and one of his first times in Japan, he spoke to a conference of thousands of pastors. And does anyone remember his one-line sermon that he had for the people of Japan, the pastor of Japan? He said, I hate you. Then he said it 3 times. I hate you. I hate you. I hate you. He said that to them. And then as part of that, the true story was that for Pastor Cho, the pastors got up one at a time, and they came before him, and they asked Pastor Cho for the forgiveness of the crimes the Japanese people had committed on the Korean people. And then he was able to change his tune, and he began to say, I love you. I love you. I love you. What a beautiful story that we shared that first week. But Pastor Mark, why are you going back to this story? Why? Look at that word up there. Scandal. Everyone loves a good scandal, right? They hear something bad that happens, they're like, oh, there's some dark, dirty secrets to this whole thing, the truth behind this story, there's things going on. And 1 or 2 people in this congregation actually reached out to me and said, hey, do you know about Pastor Cho and what he's done, that you would share a story about this man? Because there's a great scandal about Pastor Cho. You want to hear it? Of course you do. You want to hear the scandal, don't you? Here's what it was. According to the Korean Internet News Portal, in September, same time of year, 2011, so this goes back quite a few years, 30 elders of his church made a formal complaint that Dr. Cho and his son had misused over $18.7 million of church money. Now, what's shocking about that to me is that he can talk in the $1 million range as a church and giving. We don't get anywhere close to that. But $18.7 million of church money, listen what he did with it, to purchase shares of stock. You see, Dr. Cho stood trial on charges that he ordered church officials in 2002, so this goes all the way back to 2002, to purchase 250,000 shares of stock for iService. That was a company owned by, listen to this, his oldest son, at a price 4 times higher than the market value, causing the church to lose a great deal of money. Prosecutors argued that Dr. Cho's son had asked his father to purchase the shares at a much higher cost to recoup the money he had lost in stock investments 2 years earlier. That was the claim that the court had accepted. That was the bad story or the scandal that goes along with this. And I purposely saved that piece of the story 3 weeks ago because I knew Dr. Cho wasn't all quite right. And when you looked at this story of Jonah, you think by now, after being swallowed up by a fish, and he stays there for 3 days, spit out, does the work, and evangelists, that his heart would be right. But we get a good sense in chapter 4, verse 1, that Jonah seemed very wrong. This seemed very wrong that these people came to the Lord, and he became angry. Something's not right here. There's something scandalous the way a prophet of God should be acting when all these people come to the Lord. And it seems like Jonah is tangled with the evil. Look at this. Where? Within. Deep within, he doesn't seem quite right. And this is a gospel reality for us. God takes the time, as we looked at this 2 weeks ago in Revelation chapter 3, to discipline and correct, and to deal with the sin that we have, where? Within our own lives. And so I think when we get to see in this story, we see God, as we look at this chapter today, working within, trying to correct and discipline Jonah for his heart not being right deep within. He seems to almost love the way he's been kind of characterized to these people. Like, he did the work, but he wasn't happy about doing it at all. So here's what we're going to consider here. Consider Jonah's prayer to God to deal with the enemy or sin that is within. So Jonah chapter 4, now looking at verse 2. And this is a great way he starts us off. Because even there where he sees this is wrong and he becomes angry, he did what? He prayed to the Lord. Isn't this what I said, Lord, when I was still at home. So now this takes us all the way back to the beginning of the story. We get now invited into this part of the thinking of Jonah. We didn't know about this, but this is where when it comes out in this prayer, he says, look, isn't this what I said, Lord, when I was still at home? That is what I tried to forestall by fleeing to Tarshish. This is why I ran away. This is what he says. This is crazy. I knew that you are a gracious and compassionate God, slow to anger and abounding in love. What's up with that, God? Crazy, right? But he knows God, and he knows how he really is. Gracious and compassionate, slow to anger and abounding in love. A God who relents from sending calamity. He says it right there. Now, Lord, this is how distraught he is. But take away my life, for it is better for me to die than to live. But the Lord replied, is it right for you to be angry? Is it right for you to be angry? Jonah had gone out, sat down at a place east of the city. There he made himself a shelter, sat in its shade, and waited to see what would happen to the city. And we'll stop right there, because we kind of see in this the enemy within, right? And he says it by this prayer. And I think this is good. This is a good thing for all of us. If there's something you're dealing with today, deep within your heart that no one else in this place knows, maybe even your family doesn't know about, but you got this sin deep within. Here's one of the best ways to deal with it. And Jonah recognizes it, and what does he do? He gets it out by confessing it to the Lord. Like I've even been in a belly for 3 days, and the prayers that I prayed there were surface level, not even real. But here's the real confession of where my heart is. He lets it out. What an encouraging thing for all of us to do in our lives. Deep within, if there is a sin, it needs to come out. And so much so, I think we love our sin. This is why I even titled this way. We hold on to it as if we can't get it out. We love it so much we must wrap our arms and keep it within us, and that no one else, we don't even confess it to God, those deep places. Because even when we looked into chapter 2, when he's praying this prayer to God, he doesn't mention any of this. The real deep problem deep within. He's full of anger and hatred towards the Ninevites, just like Pastor Cho was to the Japanese. We talked about this that very first week. Jonah had struggled with the Ninevites because of how evil that nation was to his own people. He hated them. He couldn't stand it. And he even says this, I'd rather be dead than alive. And realize he says this when? Even after he has spent 3 days in the fish, after that whole fish fiasco. Now he wants to die again. He wanted out, and when he prayed there, he's like, oh, Lord, thanks for saving me. He's out of the belly of the fish. Instead of digesting there, he says what? I'd rather die now, after all these people have come. After the fish fiasco, he comes back. And he even says, take my life. And if you know this story, too, from Elijah in 1 Kings 19, after he's at Mount Carmel, and he calls down the Lord, and even the leftover of Jezebel and Ahab that are still there, he struggles. Even in his success, or his failure, it's Elijah who cries. But Jonah, in his success, cries out the same thing. Take my life. I can't stand it. Let's get to the issue, though. Let's get to the deep within problem that he's struggling with. Jonah's problem of God's compassionate, yet just rule over the world. Meaning this, that God is very compassionate, as we know, but he's also very just. The problem with Jonah is he wants God to bring out his judgment. He wants justice to prevail on the punishment of the Ninevites. That's what he seems to be wrestling with here. That's what he really wants for them, God's justice. But instead they get what? God's compassion. Oh, we bother with that. And isn't it interesting that even in our lives sometimes, we constantly want God's grace. So many songs are sung about God's grace and his mercy and compassion for us, but not for our enemies. And I gotta just say this too. Even in the first service, I preached this message, and someone after the message started talking about this message was for their enemy. It was their problem. That's wrong. This message is for each of us. Do we too have struggled with this fact of God's justice versus his compassion? Because we want him to act justly over our enemies and only give us compassion. But when we see God give compassion to our enemies, We struggle with it. If you've been a Christian for any length of time, even as a pastor, I'll admit to this. I'd love to be able to go camping every weekend and miss church. Why can't I, God, go out and go camping every weekend like my older brother does or other people do? They get to. Why do I have to come back and preach to these people who decide to show up when they want to? Can I confess that? Oh, Pastor Mark, I can't believe you said that. But see, that's getting to the harder, deeper problem within. Do you have problems getting that out? Do you have problems getting that out? Because God has called me to do this. I'll admit, a cross that I sometimes bear, that I'd rather be camping. Oh, what? Well, you guys all do other things on weekends instead of coming to church. Why do I have to be here every weekend? Doesn't that sound wrong? Doesn't that sound wrong to you? Because Lord, maybe in some ways I'm not as compassionate or loving as I think I may be, but rather have your justice and act on people. And I think deep within we can get to some of these same places that Jonah's at in this whole thing. And I read this in a commentary by Gary Smith. He said, the prophet Jonah, and I like this, and the messenger today, meaning us, must not second-guess God's desire to bestow his compassion on others. God will and does act in justice against sin. That's what we want. But, this is what Gary says, his great love for every person in the world causes him to wait patiently, right? To give graciously, to forgive mercifully, and to accept compassionately even the most unworthy people in the world. And you can take world out and put in your life. The person you can't stand, are they deserving of God's compassion and mercy? And you see the Savior within about we see who God really is, because this is the problem Jonah has, who the real God is. He's gracious and compassionate, slow to anger, and abounding in love. And he had a problem with that. You know he wasn't thinking right. And maybe you're here today and you're not thinking right because you got that evil thing within that doesn't allow you to see the graciousness and compassion and slow to anger and abounding in love of God. But he asks this question, and this is what I like about this, because he doesn't let Jonah stay there. He doesn't let him just wallow in his anger with the Lord or even with the people of Nineveh. He asks a question. God says, is it right for you, Jonah, to be angry? One of the reasons I pick pondering questions often in my sermons is to get you to think. And God is asking Jonah right there after he says that prayer to him, do you think it's right for you to be angry, Jonah? And so I want to take all of you down this and ask you this question. And you can flip over in the back of your bulletin and write this question out. Let God ask you this in your life. Is it right for you to be, and you fill in whatever it is you need to. See, it was anger for Jonah. But there are many other things. Maybe it's God calling you today to say, what is it that you think that you're not worthy or you're not able to tell other people about Jesus? Is it right for you to be quiet or silent about the good work that God has done in your life? Is it right for you to be unmerciful and ungracious? Or how about this one? Is it right for you to be fearful over something right now? And there's so many other things that you can fill in. Is it right for you to be jealous of somebody else? Is it right for you to be gossiping? Is it right for you to say and divide the church by talking about different people? Is it right for you? And you fill in the line in your life. What is it, as you ask that question, that God may be asking of you today? Is it right for you to be, and fill it in? And that's something you have to sit with and wrestle with God on. And you start to see that the enemy begins to win. And I read this in a commentary, 3 points. That Jonah quits serving God and others, right? What does he do here? We told in the story that he leaves the city, he separates himself from other people, and he becomes a spectator. Because even after all those people, as we looked at last week, repented, sat in ashes, wore sackcloth, they were repenting of their sins, Jonah was thinking, just maybe it was all surface level. Some people, believe it or not, come to church only on the surface level. And they can pretend like they're confessing their sins, but God isn't changing anything in their lives. So maybe, just maybe, Jonah thinks, if I go out and sit outside and wait, maybe, just maybe, God will destroy this whole city. And that's what he goes out and waits for. He becomes a spectator. And this commentary was a very interesting thing. In the life of the church, even today, this is what happens to people when they don't deal with the enemy or the sin that's deep within their own lives. They quit serving God. They separate themselves from others, and they become a spectator to the things of the Lord. Put that in your mind. Because if something is pulling you away from God, ask yourself why. This is what people do. And as a pastor of a church who gets himself even upset about people that come and go to this place like it's something you only do when you feel like it, I struggle with that a little bit. But it's interesting to watch. Usually the reason people disappear from worship or serving God is because they got something they're not dealing with in their own lives. Ooh, that's too deep to look at, Pastor Mark. Let's keep it on the surface. Let's just talk about the surface stuff up here. But the reason many people stay away from God is something deep within they're not dealing with in their lives. And they become in many ways like a Jonah. Quit serving God, just separate themselves, and just sit down. I'm going to be a spectator to the things of God. Is that the right way to handle it? Consider this. And this is the neat part about this story, I think. Because if the story just ended there and didn't conclude what we're about to look at, you see a God who's working and cares for this prophet who's got evil within he's not dealing with. But God deals with the sin that is within by providing yet another object lesson. You know, the fascinating thing about the story of Jonah that we've looked at all this week, people remember, without a doubt, when they mention the name Jonah, if you know anything about the story, you think of what? Oh, it's the great fish. And we've already looked at two things, and the Hebrew word is the same for each one of these things that God provides. He provided a storm when Jonah was trying to run away. The storm knocks him off the ship, and God then provided a fish that swallows him up. But what we're about to look at is three other things that God provides that often people forget about in this story. They remember the storm, they remember the fish, but they don't remember the plant, the worm, and the wind. These are three other things you're going to see that God literally provides. Now, as I thought about this a little bit this week in this story, you know, it's one thing to train a big fish. You see this in places of the world where they can train a fish to jump through a hoop, right? Have you ever tried to train a bug to do anything you wanted it to do? I mean, the fact that you're seeing God, you're going to see this in this part of the story. Have a worm do exactly what God wants it to do. Have you ever seen a worm on your driveway after it rains, maybe yesterday? See it wiggling around? You ever go back into the yard? What does it do? Just stands there floundering around. It's not going to listen to you at all. But God provides this yet another object, couple objects here, to teach Jonah where he is with the evil deep within his life. He provides a plant, a worm, and a wind. When I think of the amazing thing of the book of Jonah, can you stop thinking about the fish and think about the plant, the worm, and the wind, as we're going to see? Because here's what happens in this story then. You see, then the Lord God provided. Same thing as it did with the fish. Then the Lord God provided a leafy plant and made it grow up over Jonah to give shade for his head to ease his discomfort. And Jonah was very happy about the plant. Yeah, who doesn't like sitting under a shade tree? But at dawn, the very next day, look what happens here. God provided a worm, which chewed the plant so that it withered. When the sun rose, God, look at this once again, provided a scorching east wind, and the sun blazed on Jonah's head so that he grew faint. And now look what happens again. He wanted to die, and he said, "It would be better for me to die than to live." But God said to Jonah, here's another question. Is it right for you to be angry about the plant? It is. And see, here's where he finally gets the answer, right? And he confesses this, right? It is, he said. And I'm so angry, I wish I were dead. But the Lord said, you have been concerned about this plant, though you did not tend it or make it grow. It sprang up overnight and died overnight. And should I not have concern for the great city of Nineveh, in which there are more than 120,000 people who cannot tell their right hand from their left, and also many animals? Now, I'll say this about the right hand and left hand. Some scholars debate about whether he's referring to 120,000 children. I think maybe the right hand and left hand may be how they can't decide to do things spiritually right, like to make good moral decisions, especially with the things of God, because not real familiar with him. And notice, the whole book of Jonah ends with what type of punctuation? Question. The whole book ends. There's no answer. You're not given how Jonah responds to the question. So in other words, it was given for Jonah to think about. How would he respond? It's given to us so that we think about how we respond. Jonah's rebuke or correction is more concern that he showed over a plant and he had nothing to do with. It shows up, it grows overnight, gives him shade, and then a worm comes up and he eats it and dies. He's more concerned of the destruction of that than over 120,000 people. Would you say Jonah had it wrong? Well, Pastor Mark, that's an easy question. Yes, that's correct. He didn't have it right. He was more concerned about a plant, and because of that plant dying, he'd rather die than watching. He was out of the city, remember where he was, watching and waiting for God to come and destroy all 120,000 people. Do you think Jonah's heart was right on any of this? It was not. So here's a church rebuke or correction for all of us. And this is where we can ask this question of God: are we more concerned over whatever it is you got going in your life than the destruction of the people around here that don't know God? The fact that there are many people who are lost and aren't going to be found, but should we not be celebrating when the lost is found? Should we not be putting that as a church over any other thing that we've got going on? Ooh, wait a minute. That was just supposed to be for Jonah, not for me. This story's not supposed to be for me. It's supposed to just be for Jonah. And in the commentary this week, it says the book ends abruptly without telling us how Jonah responded to the Lord's final argument. And I like the way he concludes this. This is appropriate for what could Jonah say? What could Jonah say to God for caring more about a plant than 120,000 people? What could Jonah say? I mean, if we got Jonah's answer there, I'm hoping it would have been, "You're right, God. You're right." Or would it sound foolish for all of us? How do you respond to that question? So let's bring this to the New Testament, shall we? To Jesus. Because we've been referring to Jesus several times as he talks about Jonah, which also lets me believe that it's not a fairy tale. Jesus himself said these words, but he tells parables, and he would tell stories that tied in different things. And Jesus tells the parable in Luke's Gospel, the 15th chapter, of the parable of the older brother. Wait a minute, Pastor Mark, I never heard of that parable before. In Luke chapter 15, if you go there, there's a parable of the lost sheep, the parable of the lost coin, and the parable of the lost son. You may know it as the prodigal son story. You know the story? You remember the prodigal son story? It's the guy who boldly as a young man goes to his father. Says, "Give me my inheritance." And the guy gives it to him. Crazy, isn't it? And then the young man goes out and wastes all that money. And you know the story of the prodigal son. He wastes all of it. And he finds himself destitute and even eating with the pigs and not being able to provide for himself anymore. It's there he remembers how gracious and loving his father is. And what does the young man do? He goes home. And the beautiful thing about that story, when you read about the commentaries, it said that the father who saw the young man coming goes running out to meet him. And in an Old Testament, ancient Near Eastern world, it would have been like this big scandal of seeing a father lifting up his robe, running down the road. "My son's coming home." And you laugh about that, you joke around Pastor Mark running like that. But everyone else in the community would be like, "What is the dad doing?" And he runs out and he embraces his son. See, we like that part of the story because it talks about, as Jesus did, The parable of the lost sheep, of the shepherd that goes out and gets the sheep that's lost, or the woman that tears her house apart looking for the lost coin, or the fact that we learn of the story of the son who comes back to the Father, and we're like, yay, because that's all about God's love and mercy and grace and compassion. But understand, Jesus tells this story, or these stories, for a completely different reason. You see, Jesus was with the tax collectors and sinners. They were all gathering around to hear Jesus. But the Pharisees and the teachers of the law muttered, meaning the church people of the time, in God's time, in Jesus' time, were muttering and concerned that Jesus was hanging out with all these tax collectors and sinners. And they even say, this man welcomes sinners and eats with them. After that sentence, Jesus tells the story or the parable of the lost sheep, the lost coin, and the lost son, or the prodigal son. But who he's speaking to, the church, who was getting the message wrong at that time. This is why I say, because this is where this parable is speaking, or what Jesus is saying, goes to in Luke 25 to 32. You pick up on a whole other piece of this story you may not have remembered or even understood. Listen to this. Meanwhile, the older son was in the field when he came near the house and he heard music and dancing. So he called one of the servants and asked him, well, what's going on in there? Your brother has come, he replied, and your father has killed the fattened calf. The older brother should have responded with that when hearing that news. Awesome, my brother's home. And then go running into the house to embrace his brother, because his brother was lost and now he is found. And then what a joyous thing. But you listen to what he says. And this is Jesus speaking to the church then as he speaks to the church today. Listen to what the older brother does. The older brother became angry, Jesus said. And he refused to go in. Who does this sound like? Who does this sound like? Jonah. He refused to go in. So his father went out. And what's happening now after God has extended his grace to the people in Nineveh? Where is God at right now? He's with who? With Jonah, working on him, teaching him things. And now we see in this very story, the father goes out after he embraced his son. He leaves the party and he goes out to the son who's had struggled with this. So his father went out and pleaded with him. But he answered his father, look, all these years I have been slaving for you and have never disobeyed your orders. That's even better than Jonah, right? I've never disobeyed your orders. That you never gave me even a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. And look at how he responds. But this son of yours, didn't say his brother, but this son of yours, who has squandered your property with prostitutes, comes home, you kill the fattened calf for him? My son, the father said, talking to the older son now, you're always with me, and everything I have is yours. Do you think Jonah may have picked up on that part of the story too? But we had to celebrate and be glad, because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. You know what the amazing thing about that parable is that Jesus tells? We're not told how the older brother responds. We're not told whether the brother goes in the house and celebrates with the rest of the family, or he stays outside with his arms folded, getting angry at the fact that the party wasn't for him and his friends. Jesus leaves it as a question for those Pharisees and teachers of the law. It's a question he leaves for the church today as well, for you and I. Do you struggle with the fact that you have enemies that the Lord deals with and they come back? Do you shake your fist at that, at God, and say, what kind of God is this? But hear the Father tell you today, all that I've ever done is also for you. my great love and compassion. I'm slow to anger, and abounding love is also for you, not just for your other brother and sister, but it's for all people to embrace. Let's close with a story, shall we? A story of a love of the enemy from within our state of Pennsylvania. I figure we're talking about the evil within. Why not finish this off with a story from within the state of Pennsylvania? There's a time of a story of a pastor during the American Revolution. This is a true story, by the way, of Peter Miller, old Pete, Pastor Pete, who lived in Ephrata, Pennsylvania. Familiar with the area? Ever been to Ephrata? He lived in Ephrata, Pennsylvania, and he enjoyed the friendship of George Washington. You ever hear of him? George Washington, he's friends with him. And this pastor, by the way, was a smart man. He was asked by George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, to translate the Declaration of Independence in multiple languages. He did it in 7 different languages so that that declaration could be put out through the world and other nations could understand what they were trying to do as part of the American Revolution. That was old Pastor Pete did that, by the way. You don't get a lot of credit for that if you're a pastor in today's society, but Pastor Pete did it. He did a lot of good things. But also in Ephrata lived another man named Michael Whitman. He was an evil-minded man. He did all that he could do to oppose and to even humiliate old Pastor Pete. In fact, old Mike Whitman, he got sick of going to church and hearing Pastor Peter, and he quit coming to church and avoided going and ever hearing the messages that Pastor Pete ever did or said. And one of the things that he used to do to humiliate Pastor Pete was he would see him in Ephrata, he would slap him. He would slap his pastor. Can I just say this? Don't try that. I'll go down, all right? But he would slap his. So like, if you saw Pastor Pete walking to the street, he'd be like, whack! Oh, man! He'd take a shot at the guy. And he did it once, but several times it's recorded that he would hit his pastor in public. But then something happened in Mike Whitman's life. He also owned a hotel in Ephrata. And there were some people that were there dining the one night at the restaurant there, at the place they had. And old Mike Whitman started to let out that he was more in favor of England and the crown and doing the things of the British Empire. Didn't like this whole American Revolution. And there were some spies that were there, heard all Michael Whitman's belly aching about the revolution. And so they arrested Mike Whitman. And they took him as a traitor for treason. And they even sentenced him to die down in Valley Forge. That picture up there is of George Washington, the famous picture of him where? In Valley Forge. And they take Mike Whitman, it's like 70-some miles all the way down there, to be tried for treason and then hung to die. What do you think Pastor Pete did? Pastor Pete, when he heard the news of his enemy, Michael Whitman, who, by the way, hit him whenever he saw him, never came to church anymore, set out on foot. Which, by the way, I didn't tell you this, Pastor Pete had to use a cane to walk. And he walked by foot to Valley Forge. Get a sense of how far that is from Ephrata. Just driving up to Gettysburg is what, like 50 miles? Imagine walking 70-some miles for your enemy. And old Pastor Pete runs into his friend down there, George Washington. And he has a conversation with George Washington. And George responds, "No, Peter, I cannot grant you the life, listen to this, of your friend, Michael Whitman. I can't grant you a pardon of your friend." To which Pastor Pete says, "My friend? He's the biggest enemy I have." George Washington cried one word. "What?" Question mark. "What?" And George even says, "You've walked 70 miles to save the life of an enemy?" That puts the matter in different light And George Washington said, I will grant his pardon. Pete saves his enemy's life, Michael Whitman. Now the story goes on when they talk to Michael Whitman that they were about to execute him. I mean, it wasn't like he was in a cell waiting. They were ready to have him be hung, and they had to, real close, just moments away from him dying. And Mike looks out and he sees his pastor standing out there, and he goes, look at him. He comes all this way to watch me get hung. How evil. How wrong. Mike had it in his mind that Pastor Pete was watching him die. But instead, then they took the noose off and they let him go. Pastor Pete came up, spoke with Michael Whitman to let him know what happened. And do you know the two men walked the path home together? What do you think you'd talk about? It takes a while to walk 70 miles. And wouldn't you know, after that time of walking, they became lifelong friends. What an approach to your enemy. Because when you look at this story, you get to hear this happy ending. Because you know how it ends. But the question that God gives to Jonah, that Jesus gave to all those religious leaders, that speaks to the church today, is a question. How do you handle your enemies? What's deep within you and how you handle it for the Lord? Do you think it matters? Do you think it matters? Can I end today's message with a question? How about you? How about you? Would you pray with me, please? Father, we thank you for these weeks that you've given us to look at this story of Jonah, to witness and to see how you worked with the people of your enemies in Assyria, and how you worked and how you provided in the life of Jonah. Father, I pray that for these weeks as you begin to work in and provide whatever is necessary to deal with the sin that people have in their lives. And here's even a greater challenge. Could it even be deep within? The stuff we're not ready to talk about in front of anybody. But understand it's that sin that separates us. It's almost like we love that sin more than we love you. So Lord, in a greater confession of the enemy that we love within, we surrender it to you. And I pray that there's someone in this place surrendering whatever it is that's deep within, they give it to you. So they can make relationship with you. So they can love right. That they can be slow to anger and abounding in love like you are. Gracious and extending mercy even to their greatest enemies. We thank you, O God, for this message today and the questions you give.